I was awakened by a strange sound. At first, it was barely perceptible, like the faint scratching of a moth's wing against glass. But gradually, it grew louder, turning into cautious, almost deliberately muffled footsteps. Opening my eyes, I froze, listening to the silence of the house. The clock on the wall marked the seconds, while outside the night rained, thick, almost tangible. I turned on the nightlight. Its glow was soft, yet for some reason it felt foreign. My heart was beating faster than it should. Something was wrong. My home, small and cozy, was located on the outskirts of a suburb, where the sound of a passing car could be an event, and the howl of a coyote in the night was a familiar part of the background. Everything here was predictable. But tonight, for the first time, I felt as if someone invisible was watching me. I cautiously went downstairs. The floorboards creaked treacherously under my feet. The kitchen was dark, but on the table, faintly visible in the moonlight, I noticed a strange mark. A spot where the dust had been wiped away. A narrow oval, as if someone had run a finger over it or placed something on the surface. I ran my hand across the table, hoping to find an explanation, but my fingers touched only cold wood. A wave of unease washed over me. I turned toward the mirror in the hallway, not immediately realizing what had caught my eye. There, deep within the reflection, something flickered. An almost imperceptible figure. A second later, it was gone. But I was sure I had seen it. My heart stopped when it struck me that it looked like Oliver. His face, those very features I had known since childhood. I stepped back, unable to tear my eyes away from the mirror. It couldn't have been him. Oliver had left long ago. Our paths had barely crossed in recent years. But in that brief, electrified second, I was certain. It was him. I went back upstairs, leaving the lights on in every room. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, straining to hear every sound, trying to find an explanation. But deep down, I knew. This visit was real, and its meaning was yet to be understood. Morning brought a strange sense of emptiness. Sleep never came, but it wasn't because of worry. It was more the thought that I was unreachable by sleep until I understood what had happened. Deciding to distract myself, I chose the simplest way to forget. A movie. Nothing complicated. An evening show, popcorn, the darkness of the theater. It seemed like exactly what I needed. The theater was nearly empty, but even in that solitude, I felt surprisingly uneasy. While waiting in line for popcorn, I caught myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, as if there was something behind me. And then I saw him. Oliver. He was standing 2 steps ahead of me, chatting with the cashier as if everything about this was perfectly normal. Inside me, everything clenched into a tight knot and then dissolved into a flood of heat, spreading from my chest to the tips of my fingers. He turned, and our eyes met. "Sarah?" he said. His voice was just as I remembered, only slightly deeper, slightly wearier. I almost dropped my wallet. A storm of emotions surged. Surprise, anger, unease. A question escaped my lips before I could even think. "Were you at my house last night?" Oliver froze. His face went blank for a second before he frowned, as if my words had genuinely surprised him. "What are you talking about?" he asked, shaking his head slightly. "I haven't been near your house in, I don't know, months, probably." His voice carried sincerity, but something in his gaze made me doubt him. He looked exactly as I remembered him from the mirror that night. The same eyes, the same expression. I couldn't believe it was just a coincidence. "I saw you," I said, refusing to look away. "In the mirror, it was you, Oliver." He gave a nervous smile, but it was forced, strained. "Sarah, you're mistaken. I swear I wasn't there." He stepped closer, as if trying to convince me of his honesty. But instead of answering, I noticed how he avoided meeting my gaze. A shadow crossed his face. The movie started and he suggested we go in together, but I declined. My mind was too tangled with thoughts. I stayed in the lobby, watching the flickering light from the screen dance on the walls, as one thought circled relentlessly in my head. He's lying. But if it wasn't him, then who was it? The next morning, I woke up with an overwhelming feeling that I needed to leave. My encounter with Oliver hadn't clarified anything. It had only added more questions. His words still echoed in my head. I haven't been near your house. And yet, his eyes had told a different story. The decision came to me naturally. I would go back to my hometown. If there was a place to find answers, it was the house where it all began. The trip took a few hours, but it felt like an eternity. Every mile of the road brought back memories. Here we rode our bikes. There we picked berries. And just beyond that hill, there was the forest. The forest I had always thought of as my sanctuary, where everything seemed safe and unchanging. My parents' house stood at the edge of the woods, just as it always had, embraced by tall pines. It looked as cozy as it did in my childhood. White-painted walls, a carved wooden fence, and the smell of pie wafting from the kitchen. My mother hugged me the moment I stepped through the door, and my father peeked out from the living room, newspaper in hand, smiling. Everything felt familiar, yet I immediately noticed that the silence around the house was different. It was no longer peaceful. It felt watchful. After lunch, when my parents left for errands in town, I climbed up to the attic. This corner of the house had always been magical to me, a treasure trove of the past. Now, among old suitcases, yellowed newspapers, and dusty boxes, I searched for something that might connect me to the answers I sought. And then I stumbled upon the box that Oliver and I had filled with our childhood treasures. Inside were all the things that had once seemed important. Old toys, notes, drawings. One piece of paper caught my attention. It was a note. The paper had darkened with age, and the words were written in a child's hand. We can't hide from what once was. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't remember writing that. I didn't remember Oliver writing it either. But the handwriting was familiar, though I couldn't place whose it was. My heart tightened, as if something forgotten, something long buried, was struggling to resurface in my mind. I sat on the floor, hugging my knees. The forest outside the window no longer seemed so welcoming. I felt it watching me, waiting. But for what? This discovery left me with the distinct feeling that the past was whispering to me softly. You've been running for too long. That evening, my father suggested we take the boat out on the lake. It had been our tradition since my early childhood. I'd always loved the lake, its glassy surface reflecting the sky, the gentle lapping of the water, like a whisper lulling the mind to rest. As children, Oliver and I often floated here, exploring every inlet and mapping imaginary lost worlds. But now, the lake felt different. It seemed silent in a way that wasn't peaceful, as if it guarded secrets I had ignored for far too long. We pushed off from the shore, and the boat glided smoothly over the dark water, slicing through the reflections of the tall pines that leaned over the surface. The evening was quiet, but the silence felt unnatural, taut. Even the birds, which usually broke the air with their calls, were still. It's always so peaceful here, my father said, breaking the silence as he held the oars. I thought you missed being home. I shrugged, searching for words that wouldn't sound too strange. Admitting I'd come here because of the ghosts of my past wasn't something I was ready to do. Even in my own head, it sounded absurd. I just wanted to see you both, I said evasively. And remember how things used to be. He chuckled and waved his hand dismissively. Used to be? Then let's remember how you and Oliver always managed to get lost in the woods. To this day, I don't know how you two always found your way back. Oliver's name rang out like thunder in the stillness. My heart froze, and I turned sharply to look at my father. Did you ever think that something strange happened to us? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He paused, staring out at the dark water. For a moment, I thought he understood. But then he just chuckled, shaking his head. Strange? You say that like the forest came alive and whispered secrets in your ears. I looked away, sensing the conversation wouldn't lead anywhere. Maybe I was overthinking things. But just as I thought that, a faint creak sounded nearby, as if another boat had glided past us. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing, only the smooth, calm surface of the lake. "Did you hear that?" I asked, struggling to keep panic out of my voice. My father glanced at me, then scanned the water, squinting. Probably just a tree creaking somewhere, or a fish jumping. But his tone wavered, as if he were trying to convince himself it didn't matter. I kept staring at the water, waiting for the feeling of being watched to ease. It didn't go away entirely. It just receded, like a presence hiding somewhere, observing from a distance. When we returned to the shore, the evening chill was beginning to creep under my sweater. My father pulled the boat onto the sand, and I was about to head inside when I noticed the footprints. The damp sand was covered in them, as if someone had been standing there recently. But these weren't ours. They led from the water into the forest. The prints were large, the steps unnervingly even, like those of a person. "Did you walk down to the water earlier today?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced around, then shrugged. No one's been here since morning." I crouched to examine the prints more closely. My fingers touched the cold sand, and a strange thought struck me. These prints were fresh. Too fresh. I tried to imagine who could have come to the lake without us noticing, but no explanation came to mind. The forest behind us seemed to watch. Its dense shadow fell over the ground like a curtain hiding another reality. "Probably tourists," my father said, but his voice carried the same uncertainty as before. I didn't reply. The warmth of the house felt like the only safe refuge, but I knew that any sense of peace wouldn't last for long. Returning to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that invisible threads of the past were pulling me back. The footprints on the shore, the strange creak on the lake, the note in the attic, all of it spun in my mind, deepening my doubts with every step. Hoping to distract myself, I decided to run a simple, mundane errand: grocery shopping. It seemed like a banal way to ground myself in reality. The supermarket was crowded. People darted between the aisles, arms laden with baskets, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, pleading for sweets. Everything around me was noisy, ordinary, but this ordinariness didn't calm me. Instead, it magnified the sense that something was off. I wandered down an aisle, absent-mindedly picking up fruit and bread, until my eyes landed on a familiar figure: Oliver. He was standing by the shelves of canned goods. Dressed in a dark jacket, he casually inspected the tins as if there was nothing unusual about him being there. But I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was the second time he had appeared where I was. I walked toward him, a mix of anger and unease rising in my chest. He turned as though he had sensed my gaze, and a faint smile crossed his face. It was calm, but his eyes betrayed something else. Tension, or perhaps anticipation. "Are you following me?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. He slowly placed a can into his basket and looked at me, puzzled but with a trace of the same tension I had caught earlier. "What?" "No, of course not." He shook his head, but his gaze flickered slightly, as if avoiding my directness. "I didn't even know you were here." "Then why do I keep running into you?" I demanded, my voice tinged with distrust. "First at the movie theater, and now here. Is this just coincidence?" He chuckled, but his smile was oddly empty. "Sarah, it's just chance. I swear. I don't know why you're so upset." His voice sounded sincere, but something in it kept me from believing him. I crossed my arms, irritation building inside me. "You don't understand?" I pressed. "Then tell me, Oliver, what were you doing outside my house a few nights ago?" "I wasn't at your house," he said finally, trying to sound confident, though his voice wavered slightly. "You're lying." The words came out before I could stop them. "I saw you, or—" I hesitated, the absurdity of the situation swelling inside me. "Or it was someone who looks exactly like you." His expression softened, but not with reassurance. It was more like exhaustion. "Sarah, I don't know what you saw, but it wasn't me. Honestly." He took a step closer, his voice lowering to a gentler tone. But I feel like something isn't right. Something I can't explain. It's not just a coincidence that we keep meeting. There was a sincerity in his voice, but I didn't know if I could trust it. Then he leaned in closer, his words almost a whisper. I feel like we've forgotten something. Something important. Don't you feel it too? My response caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. Because as much as I wanted to resist it, I felt the same thing. The next day, my parents asked me to help clean out the old shed in the backyard. It wasn't just a storage space. It was a relic of my childhood. Oliver and I had spent countless hours there, turning it into our headquarters, building traps, and dreaming up grand adventures. Returning to it after so many years, I realized how much the place had changed. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the shelves were cluttered with boxes, paint cans, and tools. As I sorted through the items, every object seemed to pull me back into the past. Memories surfaced of us sitting on those very crates, devising plans to save the world while sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls. The shed felt familiar, yet today it held something unfamiliar, as if it concealed more than just dust and forgotten belongings. While clearing a shelf along the back wall, I unexpectedly discovered a door I'd never noticed before. It was small, almost hidden, covered in grime and faded paint. The thought crossed my mind. Maybe I just overlooked it all these years? But something inside me whispered otherwise. The door seemed out of place, as if it had been put there against the natural order of things. I turned to my father, who was sorting through tools on the other side of the shed. Dad, did you know there's a door back here? I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He glanced at me with mild surprise and walked over. A door? He frowned, studying it. I've never seen this before. Maybe it's been here since we first bought the house? I doubted that. A door like this couldn't have gone unnoticed for decades. It looked too strange, like someone had deliberately aged it to make it seem old. I tugged on the handle. The door opened easily, as though it had been waiting all this time for someone to find it. Behind it was a small storage closet, dusty and crammed with boxes. But that wasn't what caught my attention. Among the clutter, my eyes were drawn to a map, neatly folded and pinned to the wall. I pulled it down and unfolded it, and a familiar feeling washed over me. This was something from my childhood. The map depicted the forest, with a crude circle drawn in its center, labeled Forbidden Zone. I remembered how Oliver and I had always been terrified of that place. It wasn't just because our parents had warned us to stay away. It was something deeper, an invisible but palpable menace that seemed to linger there. There was another inscription on the map, scrawled in the corner. Where it began, it will end. The words lit up in my mind like a beacon. When I turned back to my father, he was staring at the map with the same confusion I felt. Where did you find this? He asked. On the wall, I replied. Oliver and I never saw this before. Dad, are you sure you don't know where it came from? He shook his head, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as if he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Inside, I felt a storm brewing. This map was more than just a childhood relic. It felt like a key to something that had been hidden from me all these years. I slipped the map into my pocket and continued cleaning. But the thought that this discovery wasn't a coincidence wouldn't leave my mind. By the end of the day, I knew what I had to do. I had to call Oliver. Late that night, sitting on the bed in my old room, I couldn't take my eyes off the map. It lay before me, and every crease seemed like part of a puzzle buried deep in my childhood. Where it began, it will end. Those words echoed relentlessly in my head, as if calling me to do something I hadn't yet realized. I picked up my phone and dialed Oliver's number. The line crackled before his familiar voice came through. Sarah? He said, surprised. What's going on? I found something, I said, not bothering to hold back. Do you remember our old shed? There was a door behind the shelves, and a map. It marks the forbidden zone in the forest. Oliver, do you remember anything about it? He was silent for a moment. I heard a heavy breath on the other end, and it made me tense up. He knew something, but he didn't want to say it. I'll come over, he said finally. Where are you now? We agreed to meet at the old motel near the lake. As kids, the motel had always seemed strange to us. Dilapidated and isolated from the usual tourist paths, it had fueled our imaginations. We used to make up stories about spies staying there or criminals hiding out. Now it looked even more rundown than I remembered. Peeling paint, broken windows, a faded sign hanging over a locked door. I arrived first. The darkness of the forest surrounded the motel, wrapping it in an invisible cocoon. While I waited, memories of our childhood came flooding back. Oliver had been my best friend, but he was always something of an enigma. His vivid ideas, boundless imagination, and courage drew me in, but there was always something quiet underneath, as if he carried a secret he couldn't share. Soon I heard the hum of an engine. Oliver stepped out of his car, slightly furrowed brow making him look as thoughtful as ever. He was tall, his short brown hair catching the faint light from the motel's sign, and his eyes, always warm but a little distant, met mine. Hey, he said softly as he approached. Show me what you found. I pulled the map out and spread it across the hood of his car. He leaned over it, and I noticed how his face tensed. This can't be, he whispered. How could it have been there all this time? Are you sure we've never seen it before? I shook my head. I'd remember it, especially the writing. Where it began, it will end. What does it even mean? Oliver straightened and looked at me. His eyes were troubled, but there was something else in them, an emotion I couldn't quite place. Sarah, he began after a pause. I've always had this feeling that something wasn't right about our childhood, like there was something we forgot. But I never wanted to dig into it. I thought it was just my imagination. Now, I'm starting to worry it wasn't. His voice trembled on the last word. I suddenly felt that something deeper had opened up between us, more than just a map or forgotten memories. Oliver had been more than just a friend to me as a child. You don't have to be afraid, I said, trying to sound steady, even as my hands trembled. We'll figure this out. Together. He looked at me, his gaze softening. In that moment, I remembered how, as kids, he'd always joke to make me laugh or grab my hand when I was scared. Now he wasn't joking, but he quietly said, Thanks, Sarah. We climbed into his car and drove toward the forest. Have you ever thought, he began, his voice low, that we didn't just forget something, but that someone made us forget? We arrived at the forest marked on the map just as dusk settled over the sky. The air was cool, filled with the crisp scent of pine. Oliver turned off the engine, and silence enveloped us, so thick it felt as though we could hear each other's heartbeat. We sat in the car for a few minutes, hesitant to step outside, as though the forest was waiting for us, and neither of us was quite ready to face whatever it held. Are you ready? I asked, looking at him. Oliver turned to me. His face, illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun, appeared calm, but in his eyes I saw something else. Not fear, but vulnerability. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered. If you're ready, so am I. His voice was warm, like a quiet promise. We stepped out of the car, and I flinched slightly when his hand lightly touched my elbow. The touch was so gentle, almost imperceptible, but it burned, carrying more weight than mere support. I glanced at him, but he was already looking toward the forest. We walked in silence, step by step, deeper into the woods. I held the map, but I didn't need to look at it. The forest felt strangely familiar, as though my feet instinctively knew the path. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood an old cabin, weathered and covered in moss. It looked abandoned, yet it retained a certain charm. My breath caught. This place was familiar. Oliver and I had played here as children, but it had never seemed this significant before. "Do you remember this place?" I asked, glancing at him. Oliver nodded silently, his expression softening with an unexpected tenderness. "Sarah, I do. But right now there's something I need to say. Something that isn't about the map, the forest, or why we're here." His words made me freeze. He took a step closer. I couldn't say it before because I was afraid. Afraid it would ruin what we had, he said, a nervous smile crossing his lips as he ran a hand through his hair. But now I realize I can't keep it inside any longer. I stood there, spellbound, my heart racing. Memories of our childhood adventures flooded my mind, but they intertwined with something new, something I couldn't quite name. "Sarah, I've been in love with you for as long as I can remember," he said softly, almost a whisper. "And I never told you because I didn't think you'd ever feel the same." I couldn't stop a smile from spreading across my face, though inside everything seemed to turn upside down. "Oliver," I began, but he shook his head. "No, let me finish," he said, his hand gently brushing mine. "You're not just a friend to me. You've always been more. You're the person I can't imagine my life without. And if this strange journey into our past has taught me anything, it's that I need to be honest with you. I can't lose you." "Do you think I didn't notice?" I whispered. "Maybe I was too blind to see it before. But you've always been the one. The one who stood by me, who understood me, who supported me. Maybe I was afraid too, afraid that if I said something, I'd lose you." Oliver didn't reply. He just looked at me in a way no one ever had before. Then he leaned in, and I felt his lips on mine. Warm, tender, filled with all the honesty he had tried to express in words. In that moment, the past fully gave way to the present. We stood in the middle of the forest, a place that had witnessed our childhood games but now became the setting where we truly found each other again. After our emotions had settled a little, we decided to enter the cabin. The old door creaked, opening a path inside. The scent of dust and damp wood enveloped us, as if the cabin itself held the memories of the time Oliver and I had spent playing here. He switched on his flashlight, and its soft beam filled the room. Inside, everything looked almost as I remembered it. The old table, wooden shelves that once held our treasures, and the broken window through which moonlight now streamed. But something felt different. It was as though the cabin held secrets, waiting for us to uncover them all these years later. Oliver walked over to one of the shelves, running his hand along its surface. He seemed lost in thought, until his gaze stopped on a box sitting on the floor. It was an old wooden chest with a metal lock, the same one we'd tried to open as children but never could. "Remember this?" he asked, turning to me. I nodded, feeling a spark of excitement flicker within me. As kids, the box had seemed like a magical object, brimming with mystery. But we'd never found the key. And now? "Do you think we'll manage it?" I asked with a slight smile, but Oliver was already looking at the wall. There, hanging on one of the hooks, was a key. It looked too new for this old place, as though someone had deliberately left it here for us to find. "Well, this can't just be a coincidence," he said, taking the key off the hook. "Do you want to do the honors?" I took the key, my fingers trembling slightly. There was something almost sacred about the moment, as though we were on the brink of uncovering something that would change us forever. I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. A soft click, and the lid creaked open. Inside was a journal. Its dark cover was worn, but the pages inside were remarkably well preserved. I opened the first page and froze. The handwriting was childlike, but neat. These were our entries, mine and Oliver's. "Are these our writings?" Oliver whispered, leaning over my shoulder. "I don't remember writing any of this." I flipped through the pages, stopping when one entry caught my eye. It was a drawing of a map, strikingly similar to the one I'd found in the shed. Beside it were the words, "We must remember what happened. We can't forget." This had to be written by us, I murmured, a shiver running down my spine. But I don't remember anything. Oliver sat down beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. He looked just as puzzled as I felt, but his presence was grounding. Maybe we were trying to protect some kind of secret, he suggested, but over time we forgot. Or maybe we made ourselves forget. I turned to the last page of the journal. There was no text, only a few words scrawled in red pencil. You are close. All that's left is to remember the truth. We both froze when a faint rustling sound came from outside the door. The forest surrounding the cabin seemed to come alive, and for a moment it felt like it was whispering. But instead of the fear I expected to feel, a strange resolve ignited inside me. I looked at Oliver, and he squeezed my hand. Whatever this means, we'll figure it out, he said quietly. Together. I nodded, and our eyes met. In that moment, I realized this journey wasn't just about remembering the past. It was about something much greater, something that would redefine who we were and what we meant to each other. Inside the cabin, a deep silence prevailed, broken only by the sound of our breathing. Oliver switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dimness and illuminating the wooden walls, worn down by time and covered in dust. In the corner stood the old chest, the very one we had tried and failed to open as children. It looked just as I remembered it, sturdy, massive, as though guarding its secret with an unyielding determination. This is it, isn't it? I asked, pointing to the chest. My voice came out quieter than I'd intended, as though the space itself demanded reverence. Oliver stepped closer and crouched beside it. It's like it's been waiting for us, he said with a faint smile. We both understood. Whatever we found inside could change everything. I looked around, a strange unease settling over me. It felt as if time had stopped in this cabin. On one of the shelves, a small key hung from a hook. I reached for it, and my stomach knotted. It fit the chest's lock perfectly. This is too convenient, I muttered, handing the key to Oliver. Sometimes answers show up when you least expect them, he replied, glancing at me with a warmth that steadied my nerves. The key turned with a soft click, and the lid creaked open. Inside, amidst the dust and old rags, lay a journal. Its worn cover bore the marks of time, but the pages inside were remarkably well preserved. I carefully picked it up and sat down on the floor. Oliver settled beside me, our shoulders brushing lightly. The faint contact was calming, grounding. I opened the first page. The handwriting was childlike but unmistakable. It was ours. The entries detailed how we used to play in this cabin, describing our games and even mapping out the places we explored in the forest. But there was something unsettling about them. The level of detail was too precise, almost as if someone had been watching us and recording everything. Do you remember this? I asked, turning to him. Oliver leaned in closer to examine the pages. The flashlight cast shadows on his face, and I noticed the furrow in his brow. No, he said slowly. It doesn't feel like something we wrote. Or maybe... He hesitated. Maybe we just forgot. I flipped through more pages until I came to one that made me pause. It was another map, identical to the one I'd found in the shed. At its center was the Forbidden Zone, marked with uneven letters that read, "We can't forget. We must remember what happened." A chill ran down my spine. The words echoed somewhere deep within me as though I had heard them before but couldn't recall where. We were hiding something from ourselves, I whispered. But why? Oliver didn't respond. He was staring at me, his gaze heavy with concern yet tinged with something softer. Sarah. He began quietly, his voice both gentle and serious. Maybe it's not just about what we forgot. Maybe it's about how forgetting changed us. I've often wondered how my life might have been different if we hadn't lost each other back then. His words caught me off guard. They were unexpected but honest. I looked at him and something stirred within me. the forest, the journal. All of it mattered. But right now, the person in front of me mattered more. He had been here all along, even when I hadn't realized it. Maybe it's not just about remembering, I replied. Maybe this is our chance to start again. His gaze locked with mine, and for a moment the world fell silent. He gently squeezed my hand. No matter what we find, I'm glad you're here, he said. I couldn't do this without you. We turned to the last page of the journal. Written in bright red pencil, the words stood out starkly. All that's left is to remember the truth. Returning to my parents' house late that evening, I felt drained, yet a strange and almost hopeful feeling burned within me. The journal we'd found, the notes, and my conversations with Oliver, all of it intertwined into an unbreakable knot. We had agreed to meet the next morning to keep unraveling this strange puzzle, but my mind refused to rest. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the connections between the map, the journal, and our fragmented memories. It felt as if the answer was just out of reach, lingering at the edge of my consciousness. Every time I tried to grasp it, it slipped away like smoke. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound outside my window. It was faint, almost like a gentle whisper. Barely audible, but it made me sit up abruptly. I went to the window and looked outside. The night was dark, and the moonlight barely pierced through the dense shadows of the forest. Standing on the path leading into the woods was a figure. I squinted, and my heart clenched when I recognized Oliver. "Oliver?" I called through the glass. He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. His face was obscured by the dim light, but something about his stance felt wrong, unsettling. I hurried downstairs, flung open the front door, and stepped onto the porch, the cold night air wrapping around me. The figure remained still. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as if waiting for me. We walked for a long time, the narrow path winding deeper into the forest until it led us to a small clearing dimly lit by the pale moonlight. At its center, hidden among thick trees, was a pit. It looked neglected, overgrown with moss and surrounded by tangled roots, as if it had been untouched for decades. But as I stepped closer, I noticed the leaves covering its floor had been disturbed, pushed aside as though someone had recently tried to reach whatever lay within. Oliver stopped abruptly, his breathing uneven. I felt his grip on my hand tighten. "This is it," he said quietly. "I know it. This place—" He trailed off, but he didn't need to finish. Memories flickered in my mind like a long-forgotten film reel. As children, we had played near this spot, but we'd always avoided it. There was something about it that had felt dangerous, forbidden. Even then, we had instinctively known that this place was not as it seemed. "What now?" I asked, looking at him. Without a word, Oliver crouched down and began clearing the branches and leaves that covered the pit. Beneath the damp earth was an old box, darkened with age. It wasn't locked, only latched shut. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside were fragments of our childhood. Photographs, crayon drawings, small toys. They were things we had clearly hidden here ourselves, but I couldn't recall when or why. At the very bottom of the box lay a cassette tape, an old portable recorder, and a note written in our childhood handwriting. Oliver picked up the tape and looked at me, his eyes filled with questions and a flicker of fear. Slowly, he slid the cassette into the recorder and pressed play. The silence of the night was broken by the sound of children's laughter. Our laughter. We froze, listening to our voices from the past. "That's us," I whispered, a chill running down my spine. On the tape, we were talking, laughing, discussing secrets. But then the tone shifted. Our voices grew quieter, and then came the words that hit me like a shockwave. "We can't forget this," said Oliver's younger voice, "even if someone tries to make us." "But what if we're scared?" my childlike voice asked. "Then we'll remember when we're ready," he replied. "We'll get through it, together." The recorder fell silent, and Oliver lowered it slowly. He turned to me. his gaze softer now, filled with something deeper than fear or confusion. "You know," he began, his voice quiet but resolute, "I've spent so much of my life looking for something I lost. I thought it was my memories, but now I realize it was you. Everything that matters has always been tied to you." "I was afraid to remember too," I said softly. "But now I know that the past doesn't have power over us, not if we face it together. Whatever happened, whatever we forgot, we've already taken the most important step. We found each other. We had chosen the present. We had chosen each other.